Hey, hello, and welcome to this episode of Learn Everyday English, your roadway to English proficiency. Glad to have you with me today. We got a topic today that's going to be a little bit different, something that you may not have heard about before, and it's not really discussed about a whole lot, but I think you're going to find this interesting. And it's a topic about passing or racial passing. And you may wonder, what is racial passing? And you can kind of get an idea about what that's about from the title. It says racial passing when black people pretend to be white. And this happened, say, back in the day, back in the 1900s. And I had some personal experience with a family member. My mother told me a story about a person in our family, and I have a book. I read about it, and the author has a story as well. But before we jump into that topic, which I think you'll find very interesting, there's 3 things you can do for me. Hey, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell your friends about it so that they can benefit from these videos too, just like you. Hey, remember I have my ebook out on Amazon called How to Talk Texan. There are 2 links in the video description below. The first link is directly to Amazon. The second link is to multiple sites where you could find the book online if you can't get it from Amazon. And also remember, if you want to buy me a coffee, you can do that. There's a link for that to help support the channel with whatever you think is appropriate for you. If you like these videos and want to see them continue, hey, buy me a cup of coffee. All right. Well, let's get into today's episode. So I adjust my glasses. So I'm going to be talking about racial passing. So you might ask, what exactly is passing, though? So I'm going to give you a definition. Passing is when members of a racial group, and this, I'm really just going to focus on, instead of saying African American people, I'm just going to say black people, because it's much easier to just use that terminology. That's kind of what I was used to when I was growing up. So when members of a racial group, in this instance black people, typically who are marginalized, and marginalized means that they're treated kind of insignificantly, like they don't really matter. They're treated poorly, and they present themselves as members of a more privileged racial group, or they pretend to be part of a more privileged racial group, which will be white people. So they're pretending to be white in order to deal with, say, discrimination, segregation, and to gain access to opportunities that are otherwise denied to them, or opportunities that they wouldn't normally have. So basically, they're pretending to be a different racial group just so they can benefit from them and have a better life for the most part. So that is passing. I don't know, have you heard this term before? Is there passing maybe in your country where you're from? Let me know in the comments below. But in the United States, passing was associated with black people passing as whites, as I said, but particularly during the 18th to the mid 20th century. So like maybe the 1700s, mid 1700s through the mid 1900s or end of the 1900s, when it was more common or popular to do this. I don't think it really happens that much today. But the origins of passing began in slavery, the times of slavery. And here in the United States, slavery existed between the 17th and the 19th centuries, the 1600s to the 1800s. And, in that time period, we say racial classification, or putting people into different classes or categories, was strictly enforced. Well, there was one, well, not the origins of slavery, but there was a rule that was around during the time of slavery called the one drop rule. And this had to do with one drop of blood. So it said anyone with even one drop of Negro blood, and back in those days, they used the term Negro to talk about African slaves or black people who were slaves. So anyone with one, even one drop of Negro blood was considered black, regardless of how they looked or regardless of what percentage racial ethnicity they had. If they had one drop of African or Negro blood, they were considered black. So you had a lot of people that were very fair-skinned, we say, or light-skinned. They had white skin almost, basically. But since they had one drop of Negro blood, they were considered black. So as you can imagine, during the time of slavery, there were slaves that tried to escape and tried to live lives as free people of color, we might say. They maybe could be considered, you could tell that they weren't white, but they were maybe light-skinned, fair-skinned. And at this time, some slaves did get their freedom or earn their freedom for maybe things that they did. And a lot of them went up north and lived as free people of color, free men of color or free women of color. And you might ask, well, how did these light-skinned black people come about? Well, on the plantations are the big farms and landowners who had slaves to work in the fields. You know, they were white owners. And a lot of times, and people may not want to talk about this, but a lot of times the white landowners, plantation owners, had sex with the black female slaves, and they had children from these affairs. And so over time, as the mixing continued, a lot of more lighter skinned slaves were born. And these people, if they were fair skinned or light skinned, would try to escape or to flee and go up north. So that's kind of when passing first started. They were passing themselves off as, if they could, maybe white, or if they could, free slaves of color. Maybe they weren't free slaves, but they were trying to pass themselves off as free slaves of color because they were usually lighter skinned. But the big issue with them is a lot of the slaves didn't know how to read. They didn't know how to write. And if you didn't know how to read and write, that was a, say, dead giveaway. They were not free people of color. So that was a big drawback, or that held a lot of them back. So, but by the 19th century, which is like the 1800s, blackness came to be equated with slavery. If you were black, you were a slave. If you were white, it was equated to freedom. You had your freedom, but if you were black, you didn't have your freedom. You were slaves. But something happened in 1865. We call it, it was post-emancipation. Emancipation just means when the freeing of the slaves. The slaves were considered free formally by the country. In 1865, a law was passed, the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, like I said, in 1865. But what happened was, you know, a lot of the white people still didn't want to accept the fact that they had to be equal to black people. So a lot of laws were initiated called Jim Crow laws. And these were racial segregation laws, like to separate the black people from the white people and to promote racial inequality, And these Jim Crow laws were mainly enforced between 1877 and 1965. So here are some of the Jim Crow laws that were in force or in place. So the first area was segregation in public spaces, which was separate schools for black and white children. Segregated transportation, which meant buses and trains. There were separate restrooms, water fountains, and waiting rooms. and there was restricted access to certain restaurants, theaters, and parks just for black people. They had their own parks. The second area of Jim Crow laws had to do with voting restrictions for black people. There was a literacy test designed to make it difficult for blacks to vote. And since a lot of them may not have been able to read or write, if you couldn't pass these literacy tests, you couldn't vote. So that made it difficult for them. There were something called poll taxes that many blacks couldn't afford. So if you went to the polls to vote, they had blacks, they charged a tax or a fee or payment for them. But since they were poor, they didn't have the money, they couldn't pay the poll tax, they couldn't vote. Also, they had a grandfather clause saying that they only allowed black people to vote if their ancestors had the right to vote before the Civil War. And as most black people didn't have grandparents that were allowed to vote before the Civil War, they couldn't vote. So they made it very hard for black people to vote. The third area, there was a ban on interracial marriages. So, black people and white people couldn't marry. There were laws prohibiting that, or even relationships between black people and white people. The fourth area had to do with employment and economic discrimination. So there was restrictions on types of jobs that black people could get and have fair wages for black people. A lot of times they didn't have the same wages. They weren't paid the same. They got a lot less money, so the wages weren't fair. And there was segregation or separation in labor unions and professional organizations. The black people couldn't associate with the white people in a lot of these professional organizations. And also the fifth area, there was legal and law enforcement bias. So in the legal law enforcement system, black people were treated differently and a lot stricter. So there was unequal treatment in the court system if they had to go to court. And there was harsher punishments for black people in the court system. Blacks were often excluded, too, from serving on juries. And the sixth area of these Jim Crow laws, there was neighborhood segregation. That meant that there were laws and policies that kept black people out of certain neighborhoods or preventing, so they couldn't, say, move into certain areas, neighborhoods that white people were living in. They had to live in their own neighborhoods. And a lot of times they were prevented from owning property. So it just made it very, very difficult for black people to, say, get ahead here in the United States under these Jim Crow laws. But these Jim Crow laws eventually began to be abolished during, you probably heard what's called the Civil Rights Movement in the late 1960s here in the United States. So there were three very important cases here. The one is called Brown versus the Board of Education, which happened in 1954. And this declared that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, like it wasn't fair. So the schools had to accept black and white children in the same school. There was a Civil Acts Right of 1964, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. And then there was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discrimination or discriminatory practices, like having to take literacy tests and having black people pay poll taxes when they went to vote. So a lot of these laws helped to eliminate a lot of the Jim Crow laws. But as things happened, although these laws were on the books, we say, or official, it took time to implement them, and it took time for the changes to take place. It wasn't instantaneous. But what happened as the laws were kind of lifted or wasn't as strict, there was something called the Great Migration. Actually, that started taking place in the beginning of the 1900s, all the way through the 1970s, called the Great Migration. And that's where millions of black people who were living in the South, and most of the slavery and the discrimination and the Jim Crow laws occurred in the South part of the United States. So when a lot of black people tried to pass, they would flee the South and try to escape up north. And then when some of these Jim Crow laws were being declared unconstitutional, a lot of black people started to leave the South and migrate toward the North, and this is what was called the Great Migration. And during this time, the concept of passing, or black people trying to pretend to be white, increased because they saw it as an opportunity to go somewhere different and to establish and make a new life for themselves. And they still knew that if they were considered to be white, they would have a lot more benefits and life would be easier for them. So a lot of people started to pass and get involved in racial passing, pretend to be white during the civil rights movement. But then once the civil rights movement began to have more popularity, the issue of racial passing started to decline and become less popular. But you might ask, say, why did black people try to pass as white anyway to begin with? Well, they tried to, like I said, go around, we say circumvent, or to go around the barriers that were imposed by, that meant that were established and enforced by the Jim Crow laws. They wanted to get better jobs. They wanted to have better access to better education or even higher education like college. And they wanted to get access to better housing. So that's a lot of the reasons, just basically just to have a better life for themselves and especially a better life for their children. But what were some of the negatives or the potential problems? But what happened, a lot of the black people that had to pass, when they left their families in the South, they moved up to the North, or some went to the West Coast to California. They had to live like a totally new life. They had to live a totally different life. They had to pretend to be something that they weren't. So a lot of the people that they began to know or get acquainted with, make new friends, they didn't tell them that they were black. They didn't tell them that they were fleeing the South and trying to live as white people. So they were told them, hey, I'm a white person. I moved here. So the white people they met up north didn't know they were black. So they had to keep their past hidden all the time. They had to leave their family and have a lot of times a complete disconnection from family and abandon all their families and relatives in the South and abandon their communities where they grew up their whole life and abandon their cultural identities and completely take on a new persona, a new way of life. And as you can imagine, that's very difficult to do. And they were also worried about being discovered. Somebody would find out, hey, you're not really white, you're black, pretending to be white. And that could have, say, grave repercussions or cause grave difficulties or problems for them, for they could lose everything that they worked for up to that point in time. They could lose their relationships, marriages if they got married, children didn't know they were white, their husbands didn't know they were white, or wives didn't know they were white. And sometimes they could face physical repercussions. They could be beaten for doing that, or maybe at the job they found out, hey, you're not really white, you could be fired from your job. Your whole life would be over as you know it. So it was a very difficult, a lot of times difficult decision for people to make, to decide to pass as white people. And I read a book, or I have a book on my Kindle called Chosen Exile by the author Allison Hobbs. And she discovered this issue of racial passing one day when her aunt told her a story about her family, or one of her family members. And I thought it was very interesting, and I wanted to pass it on to you. So Allison Hobbs, this author, said her aunt told her that they had a relative back in the early 1900s who was a female, a lady, but she decided to get involved and pass as a white person. So Allison Hobbs, was as a black person. So she said her aunt told her she had a distant relative who grew up in the south side of Chicago, which was in a historic black neighborhood in the 1920s and 1930s. So this relative grew up as a black woman, black child, black teenager in this black part of Chicago her whole life. And she grew up in the black culture, so that's all she knew. So she looked white. She had very fair skin, white skin. And her mother made a decision for her and told her, hey, when you graduate from high school, we're gonna send you to California, and you're going to live there, and you're going to pass as a white woman. You're going to pretend to be a white woman. But the mother thought that this was the best way to improve her daughter's opportunities and life circumstances and give her a better life for herself. But at first, the daughter didn't really want to go. She didn't want to pass as white. She was happy being a black young woman. She wanted to stay in Chicago, but her mother was persistent. And this relative ended up going to California and living life as a white woman. So she was there like 10 years. A decade later, she married a white man. She had children with the white man, and nobody knew about her background. Her husband didn't know she was black. Her kids didn't know she was black. All her friends there didn't know she was black. But this is the sad part of the story. One day she got a phone call from her mother in Chicago saying, hey, your dad is very sick and he's dying. You need to come back home to Chicago for the funeral because he's not going to live much longer. And the daughter said, hey, I can't go back. I've been here over 10 years now. I've made a new life for myself as a white woman. I can't go back and risk the chance of people finding out that I'm black and maybe lose everything that I've made for myself here. There's no turning back, she said. Everything she had built could be destroyed and brought to life. So this is an example of the sacrifices that people had to endure to make when they decided to pass as white people. So they had to sever or cut all ties with their history and family. So this is a heartbreaking story, and it's very profound to have to turn your back on your family, your history, your culture, and your former life. So it wasn't easy. So I want to tell you another story that I heard of from about a family member. Remember when I was a teenager, maybe 13, 14, 15 years old, I was home, and a relative of my father who was living in New York came to visit us. I'd never met him before. I think he had never come to visit us in Houston. And so while this relative was there, I was with my mother in the kitchen, and my mother told me, hey, he's passing, this relative of my father. She said, hey, whispered to me, he's passing, he's passing. I'd never heard that term before. Like I said, I was like 13, 14, 15. So this was in like the maybe mid 1970s. And I asked my mother, I said, what is passing? What do you mean? And she said, he's passing as white. He's passing as a white person. He's pretending and living his life as a white person in New York. And I remembered I said to myself, I may have even asked her, why would he want to do that? Why would he want to do that? He's black. If you're black, you're black. Why would you want to pretend to be something you're not? And I just couldn't understand that. And she didn't have an answer. So sometimes people think it's worth it for them to do that. So that was my experience with a family member who was passing as white. And as I recall, we never saw this relative again or ever had any contact with him again. But I wanted to show you some, because for me, I'm considered to be maybe a light-skinned black person. And I want to show you some pictures of my family. My mother was, a darker-skinned, African-American woman. But my dad's side of the family was very fair-skinned or light-skinned. You can see my dad had light skin. And here's a picture of my dad, me and my brother. And then here's a picture of my grandmother, my dad's mother. See, she was very, very light-skinned. She looks white. She actually had red hair. We called her Big Mom. And then also is another picture with my dad's sister. And she's very light-skinned. She could pass as white as well. We called her Nanny. So my father's side of the family was very light-skinned. But the interesting thing about it is that they always considered themselves to be black. They never tried to pass or say they were white, even though that they were very light-skinned. They lived in a black neighborhood. They interacted with black people. And, so there was something, why somebody would want to pass was something that was very confusing to me, and I could never understand that because it was something that I never experienced in my immediate family before. So, but I want to say this, my father and mother grew up in Louisiana, and we used to visit there a lot during the summer when I was a kid and teenager. But I always remembered that there was not a lot of mixing of the races. Black people lived in black neighborhoods, white people lived in white neighborhoods. Black people went to the black park in town, white people went to the white park in town. There was my family was Catholic. There was a Catholic church that all the black people went to. There was a Catholic church where all the white people went to. So there wasn't a lot of also mixing, like friends, white people coming over to your house and having a party or watching TV. You black people interacted with black people, and I'm assuming for the most part, white people interacted with white people. But, we went to the store, you had to interact, the races would interact and that type of thing. But I know it's changed a lot today, but growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Louisiana, I always considered it kind of backwards in a way, backwards. But that's my story of what happened to me, family member, and some of the research I did on passing. And I wanted to share this with you as something different. So have you heard about this topic before, passing? Is it something that's happened in your country? Hey, let me know in the comments before. I'll close with this. I know, I've been studying Spanish, and I ran across several videos about blanqueamiento, which is people trying to whiten their race by darker skin, maybe Latinos or Hispanic people, marrying lighter skinned people because maybe their kids would be lighter skinned, and in some countries I think it was maybe more common than other countries. I saw some videos, I guess, about in Dominican Republic. Some people were saying, hey, if you were darker skin or black, had black skin, you were kind of treated a little differently than if you had fair skin. And in Argentina, there was a purposeful done where they wanted to have more people, say, come over from Italy and fairer skinned people to kind of help dilute the black skin population. I don't know how much truth is in that. There were some videos I saw, so I don't know much about it. So let me know in the comments, did these types of things happen in Latin America or Spanish-speaking countries? Do you have this same type of issue with, let's say, racial prejudice or segregation, or people trying to pass as something that they're not? Hey, let me know in the comments. I'd like to get your input. So thanks for watching this episode of Learn Everyday English. Remember, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell your friends about it. And I'll be bringing you more videos like this. So I think that'll do it. Hey, have a good weekend, wherever you are, and we'll talk to you later. Goodbye.